DeGraff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As a El Paso County peep as well, yeah, this was brought to us to say we would like that the current county clerk and recorder would like this stricken, strickled from the bill because it's not representative. I think it's being misused. Now, the interesting thing about this was that around this election that is being discussed, there were several races that were determined, and the outcome was approximately 65-35. One race had a winner at about with a very small percentage of votes to be counted, and then the next morning it was completely reversed and chalked up to the oopsie clause. We have a lot of those in the gold standard. So with the 65-35-ish multiple elections, there were individuals that had run their campaign based on the knowledge that the election system, often referred to as the gold standard, was anything but. And so they challenged the election. And what they wanted was a hand count, because as we saw in another El Paso County Peeps election, that came down to 3 votes that were mistakenly or fraudulently counted for another candidate, and then they were removed. But not wanting to actually get into the actual depth of the record to find out how many times that happened. That it happened 3 times that we know of would demand that that entire system be taken apart. And the idea that it's the gold standard is absolutely laughable. These were, in this case, these were 3 votes where they were protest votes, I think, because the bubble was colored in and then the name and the bubble were both crossed out per the directions on the thing, and they were all 3 submitted for the incumbent. And they were rejected once they knew what they were for, what they were done, and that's how another El Paso County Peep came to this seat. And I have pictures of the ballots. I'll send them to you. I've sent them to everybody that was on the board for the committee for the SMART hearing where we discussed the gold standard. But anyways, this election that we're talking about, they were 65-35, and they wanted to actually do a hand count. They wanted a hand count of the ballots that could have been accomplished in about a day. And instead, this election system was dragged all the way to the Colorado Supreme Court. And so there were people that were frustrated. And I went to the county clerk and recorders, and I stood outside the glass where I could receive about 20 different Wi-Fi signals, and I could watch the vote, and I could interact with the people. Now, I wasn't there all the time, but I can tell you that there was no violence. The police were downstairs. They were all hanging around a desk. It's kind of like here when we bring in extra police for the Second Amendment hearings. The police are all downstairs because they're good people. So there was a narrative, a very false narrative that was presented. And so these that are around El Paso County, I'm chagrined to say, are all based on a false narrative. So we have the bill that's justified by saying something is the gold standard, and then we use the political narrative that is untrue, that would have been easily verified to be untrue. So I think this is a good amendment, because once again it proves that it just demonstrates, I think, legislation 101. What it says it is, it ain't. This bill purports to be about election interference and intimidation, but really what it is, it's just another way to disarm the law-abiding citizens of Colorado. And whatever it's based on, if it's going to be truthful, then these lines need to come out based on the testimony of the people that have the best knowledge of it. If these lines are critical for the bill to justify it, then the bill is a lie. So I recommend an aye vote on this. And I think we ought to, if we want to get to the heart of why people are frustrated with the election system, AKA the gold standard, I think we need to dig into that. But to treat it as such is a gross mischaracterization of all involved. So I recommend an aye vote on this amendment.
Representative Lott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This particular amendment is also important because if this language were to stay in there, then we do have a question related to freedom of exercise, the right to freely exercise one's faith and belief in a public space. These people who are being characterized as intimidating because they prayed. Now, I don't agree with what is listed here as what they prayed. I don't know if that is accurate or not. I don't agree with that. But in any case, they exercise their right to practice their faith by praying in a public space during a public election. If the bill sponsors are implying that such behavior as prayer is intimidating, coercive, and threatening, we have even more issues with what this bill is doing. Now, some might be like, that's ridiculous, but all you have to look at is a little bit over the pond at people who are being arrested on criminal charges for praying silently outside of particular places on public sidewalks. So it's not beyond the pale in the 21st century that such a thing would take place. And so I think it's important for anyone who looks at this in the future to know that their free exercise is not being infringed upon by this policy, especially as relates to public spaces and elections. I urge an aye vote.
Representative Kelty.
I want something that's nappy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That wasn't me. I don't know what that was. It's talent. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I agree with this amendment. You know, for El Paso County to be carved out as being a problem in the election, you know, with election workers and First Amendment right, and it's a total and absolute mischaracterization of what actually happened. And the information that's in here is not actually 100% accurate. So if we're going to put information in a bill, it needs to be accurate. And I agree with the clerk and recorder of El Paso County that by including this, you are mischaracterizing the information, and it needs to be removed. You know, you don't want us talking about other areas, about how we think they're, you know, for lack of a better term, a hellhole. But yeah, you're going to allow something like this be put into the bill. It does need to be struck, and I'm asking for a yes on this amendment so we can at least get back to business and what this horrible bill has to say. Thank you.
Representative DeGraff.
I just wanted to reemphasize that we are talking about disarming people. We're removing the means of self-defense. And in this case, we're justifying it on shouted at election workers and prayed for evil to descend. Now, there is the thing about Colorado Secretary of State. And one thing, I asked the police last year about some of the death threats that people had said they were being levied against them. And I asked, like, how many of these death threats there were. And the funny thing was, the was told that nothing actionable. So nothing, so angry voters, which we deal with all the time, we deal with here all the time, but nothing actionable. So I am curious, the thousands, does the sponsor have a printout or a record of the thousands of death threats that were levied against and then what was the action taken on these death threats? Because if we're going to use this if we're going to use these things for a justification for disarming the citizens of Colorado from their constitutional right of self-defense, what is the basis? Did you validate the basis of this? Now, some of the basis of this would be saying something like, perhaps saying that somebody is treasonous for running an election system that cannot be certified, that the operators, that the Secretary of State and the Assistant Secretary of State both admit does not comply, only substantially complies, whatever substantially means. And there are some people that would classify that running an election system that cannot be certified to comply with the myriad of state laws and federal laws, that they would consider that action to be treasonous. Now, perhaps that's what they said. We think that's treasonous. I don't know. I would like to see, because the sponsor has based the bill on this, that these thousands, so let's see, what does it say? Since the Colorado says she has received over 1,000. So if she says she's received over 1,000, we're using that as a basis of a bill. Has received over 1,000. We should be able to see that there are over 1,000 threats. And we should be able to see those were turned in and those were forwarded to the law enforcement, Capitol law enforcement, and that those were processed in some way, shape, or form. Otherwise, I think this is perjury. So I'd like to know, in this case, when does shouting, because that's the First Amendment, we're talking about denying the Second Amendment based on somebody's First Amendment, shouted, prayed, and received. So I'd like to see the death threats. I'd like to see the action items that are taken by that, and and the overall basis for that. Because if these were legitimate threats, then there should be some sort of action. And if they're not actionable, then we have another problem, because then we have a law enforcement system that is not enforcing the law, and then we would have a law enforcement system not enforcing the law, and then we're just adding another law to make people more criminal. So I don't really understand the point of this bill. So I do want to know specifically if the Secretary of State has turned in over 1,000 death threats, actionable death threats according to the police, and what they've done about them.
Seeing no further discussion on Amendment L0.